this is the lifestyle assessment. In full transparency, I have never used this, but thank you to the developers. I typed in lifestyle assessment PDF online, and this is how I found this. I, as I mentioned, have not used this, but I could see this being super useful to use with a therapy client because you get so much information. As you can see here, this is 17 pages, and so as we go through this, you'll see how beneficial this could be to use it with a therapy client. So we're starting out with some basic information: the client's name, the date, the therapist information, and we're starting out with asking about family information as well, so mother and father's name. And that can be helpful just so that you don't continuously refer to, like, well, what did your mom say about that? Or how did your dad feel about that? You can say, well, what did John say about that? Or how did Mary feel about that? I would not start with doing a genogram here just because genogram is more of a family systems orientation, and we'll get to that towards the end of this semester. So we're going to be getting into here on the third page, the childhood description of other children. And so this is, if you've got any siblings, how would you describe them? Write names down and put you guys in whatever the birth order is. So if you've got someone who has 5 siblings and they're the fourth one, they would, list their other 4 siblings and then, their other 3 siblings, and then themselves, and then their 5th sibling. And then any description that really stands out to them, like, Annie is quiet and she likes to read books. Mike is really outgoing and he always has friends over, etc. Any description, etc. Any description that stands out in terms of any siblings that they have. Who were you most like in terms of siblings and in what way? Who are you most different from and in what way? And so, really, you're starting to get a sense in asking these questions of not only how does this individual, your client, relate to their siblings, and also what were their relationships like in childhood? Did they get along? Did they fight a lot? That type of information. Now you're starting to get into grades. So, what were their attitudes about going to school? What was their favorite subject? What was their least liked subject? What was the social situation or standing? So, for example, were they the popular kid? Were they the kid that was bullied or made fun of? Did they get along with their teachers? Were they a teacher's pet, or were they unnoticed by their teachers in school? Did they have any types of sports interest or skills? Were they in any type of classes, such as music or that type of thing? Did they have any habits? So, for example, did they really like to read? Or were there other habits that maybe stood out that are either important from a mental health standpoint or just a psychological standpoint in general? I would ask this question kind of as a two-part question. So one, as a child, did they experience any health problems or physical problems? For example, did they break an arm, or did they ever have cancer? Did they ever have any type of, have to be hospitalized for any reason? Because obviously as a kid, that can be hugely impactful if something big happens like that when you're really little. And on the same side, if they had a family member, such as their mom was hospitalized due to a medical condition or concern, that can also be really impactful. You could imagine a situation, for example, where a mom is hospitalized and then the dad is putting a ton of energy into supporting her, and then, maybe a family friend or uh, parents or grandparents. So parents of the mom and dad, so grandparents, have to come over and help out with childcare or child support. If grandparents aren't available, or are no longer living, or aren't readily available, is that a coworker or a family friend who's coming over to help out with childcare, or are the kids just kind of left on their own? Like, hey, I'm at the hospital supporting mom. Figure out how to get dinner for yourself. And so asking if any caregivers had any, either health concerns or physical or emotional limitations, gives you a sense of what type of support did the child have, or how was this handled in terms of whatever those conditions or concerns might have been. As a child, did you feel that boys or girls had advantages over others? What did that look like? And so this can be really important because you start to get a sense of how caregivers viewed boys or girls, how the client that's sitting in front of you was kind of socialized, because we tend to treat boys differently than girls and vice versa. And I think that that is slowly starting to change now, but historically, um, boys and girls have been treated very differently. If a female, were you a tomboy in childhood? If a male, did you personally think of yourself as a sissy? Were there any type of spiritual or religious experiences, or what did spirituality or religion look like for you? So for example, did your parents take you to church every week, or did you guys engage in any type of spiritual activities or rituals, that type of thing? So you're getting at how important was religion or spirituality to this to your client in childhood specifically, and then you can ask about how that impacts them now, or are they still spiritual or religious now, what that looks like for them. Was there any type of abuse that was going on? Physical, emotional, sexual? This is hugely important because childhood trauma tends to negatively impact individuals in well into adulthood in terms of emotional maturity, their ability to build interpersonal relationships with others, their ability to interact and engage in romantic relationships. And so asking by whom, who was basically the perpetrator, how long did it go on for, how um, not only how long did it last, but how um, intense was it, I guess is how I would say, is what I would say, basically in the sense of, was it so for example, emotional abuse, was it some name calling and that was it, or was it much more in depth or much more um, intense, if you will? In terms of other siblings, who was spoiled, who ended up spoiling that person? Was it mom? Was it dad? Was it another caregiver? How and for what reason were they spoiled? Like, oh, well, Jenny is the baby. She got spoiled all the time. Who was most punished? Sometimes you'll see that the oldest sibling might get punished more in the sense that, you're the oldest, you're supposed to set a good example. So you're the one who gets punished if you're not setting a good example, that type of thing. When the family needed to be right. So sometimes you might see this, and you guys can probably think of a good movie example where, say the mom always has to be right or the dad always has to be right, and then the other parent just kind of like, goes along with it because otherwise it might result in a fight. Who in the family felt that fairness or unfairness, needed to be present or not present? What did that look like? What was your role in a group? So if you were hanging out with friends, were you the leader? Were you the follower? Were you the outsider? Were you just kind of in the middle? You didn't really stand out one way or the other. Did you have any type of talents or accomplishments? Sometimes you might have clients who were on, the sports team and really stood out, or were the, head of the football team, that type of thing. And so this is getting at, how accomplished was this individual in terms of sports or in terms of talents at all? Were they in the talent show in school? What did that ended up looking like? And then in terms of discipline methods, so, I think nowadays parents are slowly getting away from more severe disciplinary action compared to maybe what it looked like, 20, 50, etc. years ago. Um, but getting a sense of what that looked like will give you a sense of not only how the parents handled disciplinary action, but also how your client felt about their parents um, engaging in that disciplinary action. Like, oh, like for example, I've had clients who are like, oh yeah, my mom beat me, but I deserved it. Like I was like a troublemaker, so I totally deserved it. Versus someone who's like, my parent punished me and this was the punishment. And I felt that that was too much for what the punishment was. And so you're getting a sense of how they view that punishment or that discipline from their parents. And it also gives you a better sense as well of their relationship with their parent looking back on things now. So now we're sibling interrelationships, kind of coming back to siblings in terms of who took care of who. And you'll see this in clients. So, for example, several of my clients have been the oldest or one of the older siblings, and they have had to take care of their younger siblings due to whatever reason. So, for example, I've had clients who are like, I was 9 and I was trying to find baby food for, my 6-month old sibling, and I was the one taking care of them, or I was the one mixing the baby formula to feed them because my parents were both at work, or because, mom had whatever going on, etc. And so you get a sense of who was responsible within the siblings. Was it your client? Was it someone else? Who played with who? Again, getting at those inner sibling relationships. What did that look like? Who got along best? Who fought? Who was helpful in the house? Who made mischief? Who was causing trouble? Etc. And then kind of coming back to parents as the client sees them, their parents. Whoa, stumbled there. So, is their current age if they're living? How old were the parents when your client was born? So, for example, the client says, "Oh, my mom was, 29 and my dad was 33," versus that's probably their experience of being raised is probably very different from my mom was 16 and my dad was 17, and both of my parents were teenagers when I was born. What is the highest level of education? This gives you a sense of how education was treated within the home, because oftentimes parents who have received an education then a lot of times tend to push their kids to go get an education versus maybe parents who, not to be stereotypical or to generalize, I'm not trying to generalize, versus maybe parents who haven't gotten an education might say, you don't need an education, look at me, I didn't get an education, I'm doing, XYZ, I'm in a trade, or I have this job, you don't have to go get an education to get a good job. So just getting at, how did parents view education? What was their occupation? Sometimes occupation can be hugely impactful. So, for example, if your parent drove a truck and was gone all week, right? Like they're basically absent. Or if the client's parent maybe worked in a hospital setting as a nurse or a doctor, where they're working 12 to 16 hours, really, really long shifts, and they're basically never home, or basically only home, depending on what their shift looks like. So getting a sense of how present was your client's parents in their childhood, your client's childhood, that is. Personality traits, what did your client, I should really name this fake client. I'll call her Anna. Anna's easy. What did Anna like about her parents? Did she like that they were hardworking? Did she like that they were always supportive? What did she dislike? Did she dislike that they were controlling, that they wouldn't let her make her own decisions? What did she fear about her parents, if anything? What was most important to her parents? So again, you're getting a sense of how Anna's parents view occupational, like job opportunities, how they view what she should go do. And I think we talked about this in a previous lecture of, hey, was Anna's parents the type of parents who would say, hey, you have to, go be a doctor, go to business school, we want you to go do this thing. We think that this is important to you. Or the same in terms of sports, were Anna's parents the kind of parents who are like, hey, you have to win in this game. You have to always be a winner. If you're not trying hard, you're not going to be a winner in life, etc. So you guys kind of get a sense of what you're asking for in terms of these questions, and how this might show up for your client as you're asking these questions, depending on who their parents were. What behavior or attitude could win their praise? So, for example, like, kind of thinking example of someone who was on the sports team, such as football. Like, hey, if we won, My dad was super supportive. He was really happy. I got all kinds of praise, all kinds of encouragement from my dad when we won. So paying attention to what for you as for your client, Anna, in this case, for Anna, what made her what could she do to catch her parents' attention or to get their praise versus what would she do to make them angry, like, hey, we caught you sneaking out, or we caught you drinking alcohol when you're underage, or we caught you making out with your boyfriend in your room. That's a no, he needs to get out and go home, or you need to leave your door open. So getting a sense of that. What ways did they influence you? So I think this is a great question because it really forces the client, not forces, but it really asks the client to take a pause and think about, well, what were the influences, in terms of my parents? What influenced me? What stands out? What were their expectations of Anna as a child? Descriptions of your parents as seen by you when you were a child continued. So relationships with other children. How did the parents treat other children? So, for example, mom's favorite was definitely whatever, Johnny. He was the baby. Or, mom always favored Joe because he could win football games and he made her super proud. Which child was most liked? Who were you closest to? Who are you most distant from? How did that play out, or what did that look like? And sometimes you'll see this, especially for clients who went through kind of a rough teenage years, where they kind of maybe grew apart from their parents or didn't agree with their parents during teenage years, which kind of tends to be typical for a lot of individuals. And then once they kind of get into adulthood, you see them kind of circle back as they move on to adulthood and they're able to make their own decisions. Then they kind of repair that relationship with their parents. Whom did you talk to, or who did you confide in, or who did you go to for support and comfort, and what did that look like? And I say parents here, I keep talking about mom and dad, but this could be literally anyone who's a caregiver. So, for example, it could be, if the parents aren't in the picture for whatever reason, maybe due to having passed away, or due to drug use, or due to being in and out of jail, who is the caregiver that raised you? Was that your grandma, your grandpa, your grandparents combined, an aunt, an uncle, etc.? Who were these people and what was your relationship with them? As a child, what kind of relationship did they have? So this is between the caregivers, if they're married or if they're together. Who is dominant? Who is the one who made all the decisions? Um, I think of Modern Family, where Phil is clearly not the one who makes the decisions, and Claire is the one who tends to make a lot of the decisions a lot of the time. Did your parents or caregivers agree in terms of discipline and in terms of raising the children, or were there conflicts? I've had clients talk about, we were great until we had kids, and then we clashed over everything, or we didn't agree on anything in terms of how the decisions about how our kids were being raised, down to even small things like what we were feeding our kids, and so it didn't work. They broke up, etc. So just getting a sense of what did tension or what did agreements or disagreements look like. Was there open quarrels? Was there open yelling? Was there any type of open physical or emotional abuse between caregivers? What did that look like? Did the client, in this case Anna, did Anna witness those things or see those things, or was that more covert and behind closed doors, and she wasn't ever really aware of any parental or caregiver tensions? So continuing on with how did those quarrels end? So again, was there any type of abuse that was occurring, like domestic violence? Did things kind of explode into some type of physical violence, or were caregivers able to handle those arguments and fights in a more healthy manner? So basically, getting at how did parents or caregivers solve problems? And this is really good because kids are not only sponges, but it's kind of the saying, monkey see, monkey do. And so, how those relationships and interactions occurred, your client, however old your client is, has seen those things and witnessed those things. And the likelihood that they will follow in those footsteps tends to be really high unless they have taken very intentional steps to say, I'm not going to be that way. I'm not going to be like my parents or my caregivers. And now moving on to having the client, so in this case, Anna, actually consider things about herself. So, in terms of what did those interactions, how did those interactions impact how she views the world, how she views males, how she views females, how she views marriage and what marriage is like, or, um, you know, interrelationship interactions, even if parents or caregivers are not married. So, for example, you might have two adults who cohabitate and they're not married, but it's still a close enough relationship that you could ask her, what are your opinions or what are your thoughts about that? What do you think parenting life will look like based on the experiences that you've seen or the things that you've witnessed? And then this next page is kind of weird in the sense that it's a lot of data and initially you're rating it. So you're going to take all of your siblings and you're basically going to rate them on all of these attributes and characteristics. And then you're also going to rank them. So basically, I mean, this is a lot of data looking at and comparing your siblings to yourself, to each other, which can be very insightful, once you have all of the data or the client fills out all of the data to really compare and look at, kind of take a step back at what's going on there in terms of how the client rates their siblings. Additional adult figures. So this is now getting to beyond parents, what other caregivers were involved. So if the client did have parents, who else was involved in terms of grandparents, in terms of aunts, uncles, siblings, godfathers or godmothers or god uncles and aunts, etc. This can also include individuals that were maybe very instrumental in the client's life. So, for example, if Anna had a music teacher that really, helped her grow and develop, or if she had a sports coach. So, for example, maybe if she were in soccer or baseball or softball or some other type of sport, did that coach, kind of help her grow, look out for her? What was her relationship to that person? How did that person influence her? And then moving into sexual and physical development, this is hugely important because it's such a huge part of who we are as human beings. When did you first notice your sexual development? How did you feel about it? Do you feel like you were prepared for it? If your client is a female, when did she first start her menstruation? How did she feel about it? This gets into maturity and this gets into just kind of on a very basic psychological health, psychological level. How does she feel about herself as a woman? Were you prepared for it? Were there any difficulties? Have you had any prenatal or postnatal difficulties if the client has had children? If you're a boy, were you told that you should have been a girl, and vice versa? If you were a girl, were you told that you should have been a boy? And you can imagine that this tends to come up in several different types of situations. So, for example, if the client comes from some type of cultural background where boys are more valued and the culture basically says we want boys for whatever reason to carry on the family name or because boys are the ones who go out into the world and work and can make money. Or again, from more of a, hey, I've always wanted a boy, boys are the ones who carry on the family name. Who's going to carry on the family name if only girls are born, etc. So basically, how did this come up? How was this viewed? Did the client feel valued as a child, whether boy or girl? What did that look like? How did that play out? As an adult, have you experienced any sexual problems? And so this is getting at a variety of, different types of sexual dysfunctions and things that can occur, and how does the client handle those things? Have they gone to the doctor about those types of things? But also helping normalize it because a lot of sexual problems do tend to occur, and so helping normalize that for your client can be very helpful. What is their sexual orientation? How do they feel about their sexual orientation? In terms of physical development, we kind of already talked about this in terms of childhood health problems and how that may have resulted in them being treated by others. if there was any type of body image issues or any other types of disabilities. And then, were there any type of childhood dreams that occurred? Sometimes children have reoccurring dreams. Were there any type of fears? Sometimes you'll, in terms of this, you'll want to parse out what were actual fears versus, I saw this really scary movie and then I was terrified of werewolves for the next 5 years until I realized that werewolves don't actually exist. What do you want to be when you grow up? What are your current aspirations? So, current aspirations is bringing it back into the present in terms of what does the client want? What are they hoping for? And this next page has list 3 wishes that you have at this point in time. And so again, we're getting at what is the client hoping potentially to get out of therapy, or what are they hoping for their life? How do they want their life to be better or different at this moment in time? And then early recollections. So for Adlerian therapy, early recollections is very important. And so there is on this next page, 2 pages down. Here we go, 2 pages down. There's 2 pages where the client can write early recollection examples in terms of early childhood situations or events and how those different situations and events may have played out or may have impacted them as they continued to grow, especially if those are the situations and events that the client can remember back to. Usually, or very often, those emotions or those situations were emotionally charged, which means that for whatever reason, whatever the emotion that's tied to it or whatever the situation was, that stands out to the client even more. And so those can often be really important to explore, especially looking back on it now. If we scroll back up a little bit, there are summary statements. So this is basically where you as the therapist can look at all of this data and all of this information that you've gotten from your client and make some summary statements, kind of bring everything together, tie things together in terms of like, oh, I see how, this event when you were 8, maybe being hospitalized for something, ended up impacting this over here and ended up impacting this over here and ended up impacting how your parents treated you differently because maybe they felt that you were fragile because you'd been hospitalized versus how they treated your siblings, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see how you can kind of bring this all together, summarize it, tie it all together. Or if there's something that stands out that doesn't quite make sense, where you can go back and say, all right, help me understand this a little bit more. Help me understand how this event or this relationship or this thing over here ties in or doesn't tie in, or like connect the loose ends for me. That way, you as a therapist have a really solid understanding of this client in terms of not only their relationships, but any significant childhood events and how all of those tie up together to make the individual who, or to either have made the individual or have influenced the individual who's sitting in front of you. And then these next couple of pages are just, again, summaries where you as the therapist can kind of think through what are the beliefs that are occurring here that are either healthy or unhealthy, what are the self-concepts that are present, and you can write out a couple hunches that you have in terms of those summary factors that, so for example, you could say something kind of like, maybe I'll go with the example that I just came up with of, all right, you were hospitalized when you were 8, and that impacted how your parents treated you. They treated you kind of like you needed to be wrapped in bubble wrap, and that prevented you from being involved in sports, and that impacted you becoming more of a bookworm because you couldn't go out and play sports like your siblings and your peers, and so et cetera, et cetera. And you can weave together this hunch or weave together how that might be impacting the client now. So for example, so that impacts how you're not as adventurous now as you want to be, and you tend to stay more indoors. You tend to not be as active because of those things. And obviously you always want to check in with your client of, let me know if that's correct, or let me know if I'm missing something there, or so that way you're not making assumptions, but you're checking in with them in terms of this hunch that you've come up with. So that was a lot. This is 17 pages. I'll make sure that you guys have access to this in Canvas. And that is the lifestyle assessment. Thanks so much for listening.